My name's Fran. I'm one of the postdocs for the Avebury Papers project, and I'm joined today by Prue Saunders, Bev Stapleton. They're both researchers on the project as well. And I will preface the whole talk by saying this is very much still like work in progress. So if you have questions, please do ask them. I've put a piece of paper on all of the chairs, and also a pen or a pencil, or there might be one between two for some of the pens. So please use that to make a note of any questions that you have, because we'll save them up for the end, even though we've got 3 speakers. And also because this is a publicly funded project, and we like to show what kind of impact we're having in the world, any comments that you have about today's presentation would be really gratefully received. It helps us to report back to our funders. So I just thought I would start by introducing people to Avebury, in case there was anyone in the room who wasn't sure. So obviously we're very familiar with the beautiful stone circle, the largest in the world, and how it looks today. And these are the English Heritage sanctioned photographs of the golden sort of sunrise going on. But as a newspaper discovered last year, Avebury is a fake. This was the headline that a certain tabloid went with in October when English Heritage released some of their colour slides from their 1930s collection, which showed the excavation in progress. But I think, you know, we could probably be a little bit more nuanced than the Daily Mail. And we could talk about the way that, yes, there is a certain amount of reconstruction that has happened at the site. We have the photographs, which have never been a secret, of the excavations in the 1930s, which saw the re-erection of many of the stones in the landscape. And it's kind of more interesting than just a straightforward fake. You know, we also have these concrete pillars, which are very much inspired by kind of Art Deco ideas of ancient Egypt, and Alexander Keiller, who was financing the excavations, was himself inspired by antiquarians such as Stukely. So we're seeing here layers of kind of a 17th century interpretation of a site with an Art Deco twist. And here we have Stukely's famous drawing of how he thought Avebury kind of looked as the Serpentine Temple. And, we know that Stukely wasn't necessarily, he was tweaking a little bit some of the layout to fit his theories, but fairly accurate. And Alexander Keiller and his team in the 1930s did use Stukely as a guide for where they excavated. So, today we'll be talking about who made Avebury, but not in terms of 5,000 years ago, so sorry if you're here for that. We're very much thinking about who made Avebury in the 1930s, 1940s. So I'll briefly talk about the context of the project and the wider work that we're doing to find out about those people. I'll tell you a bit about the digitization project, and then show you some of the ways that we've been collecting names and people from the archive. And then I'll hand over to Bev and Prue, who will explore a little bit more some of the stories that are coming out of William Young's diaries. And really excellent to have these diaries as part of the project, really gratefully received on loan from Wiltshire Museum. And bringing them together with materials from the Alexander Keiller Museum has really enriched the project. So these are all the people involved in the project. It's a huge collaborative effort, and when our project is finished, everything is going to be housed with the Archaeology Data Service, who are providing the kind of website, which is going to be the portal to access everything. So everything that I'm telling you about today will eventually end up online forever for everybody to explore. These are the folks involved with the project. So a lot of you might have met Mark Gillings before. He's given talks at Wiltshire Museum, and he's excavated around the Avebury landscape for at least 30 years. And this project was really his idea. So together with Joshua Pollard, he's used the archive at the Alexander Keiller Museum quite a lot, looking through there to look over Alexander Keiller's team's notes to see if anything has kind of been missed. Because the interesting thing about Avebury is that not a lot of excavation has really happened there, and not all of it has been written up in the kind of detail that we need today. Obviously, Isabel Smith looked at all of the documentation from Alexander Keiller and his team, and she produced a very masterful synthesis of the excavations at Avebury, but there's still a lot of detail that's in the archive, so even though it's there and it can be found, it's not very easily accessible. And before we get permission to do more excavations, we need to have that groundwork done and sort of get the archive fully open. So that's kind of why the project is happening. So Mark and Ben are both looking at the archaeology side of things, so figuring out more about the phaseology of the site, doing new tests on the lithics and on the pottery and the human remains from the excavations in order to kind of get more precise dates for them. There's a lot of material that was excavated in the 1930s, put straight into storage boxes and has not been analysed since. So Ben is in charge of commissioning all of that research. And then I'm based at University of York along with Colleen Morgan, and we're looking at the stories of the archive. So we've got the archaeology and we have the stories. So we're coming up with the ways of inviting people in. You know, we can put lots of stuff online, but who will use it if we don't show people kind of what's there and at least give people a starting point. Obviously, a lot of you might know Ros Cleo. She's the curator at the Alexander Keiller Museum. And we also have 36 wonderful volunteers, many of whom are in the room. You can wave maybe if you want to. But I'm sure not to volunteer you all, but if anyone has questions at the end, I'm sure that people might want to jump in, so please feel free to do so. And really the kind of volunteering side of the project is making so much more possible in this project than just the kind of me alone in the archive. We've got this very expanded sort of research team, and it's really showing already how much potential there is in this archive for triggering future research and telling us so much more about Avebury, but also Wiltshire history in general. Okay, so what are we actually doing with the archive? We're fully cataloguing everything. We're digitising, we are bringing materials together from the Alexander Keiller Museum at Avebury with other collections, so notably Wiltshire Museum, but also other museums across the country, especially for the archaeological artefacts which have kind of been scattered. And over the next 12 months as well, we'll be holding a few more focus groups and workshops with people who know Avebury well, or people that are just interested in Avebury, as we try and work out how to make a website that people really want to use. So that's what we're doing in a nutshell. And this is kind of, I thought I would tell you a bit about each of these processes. So digitisation is not just photography, but photography is obviously very important. We have photographing, and that has all been done on the paper side of things. We're also photographing some of the artefacts as well. And everything, all the photographs, will be able to be reused in however people want to. You know, you can make a T-shirt with your favourite archival object on, completely open access and for free. We are cataloguing everything, and by cataloguing I mean describing every single item in the collection. So as of now, I can't actually still tell you how many objects we're working with on the paper side of things, because up until this point, materials have been stored in boxes, and the catalogue might just say a box of letters. So we're going through every single letter and cataloguing that. We're also transcribing as well, so that involves looking at all of the text-based documents, so any letters and diaries. Some of them are typewritten and some of them are handwritten, and actually, kind of drawing out the text from there in order to make it searchable. And we're researching people. So at the moment, we've got 1,132 names which have come out of the archive. So we've got 17,000 digital files, over 7,000 items, 400,000 words have been transcribed so far just from the diaries. If we take into account everything else, I haven't counted that yet because it would take a long time, and all of these names. So why are we collecting these names in the archive? I thought I would just pull out this chunky bit of text from our kind of project values statement, and I really love the sentence about how we aspire to share stories about who has made Avebury what it is today, which have been underrepresented or overlooked. So even the Alexander Keiller Museum itself, and this is something that Ross says, you know, it kind of puts Alexander Keiller up there as though he was the only person that made everything happen. And that is obviously not the case. And I don't think that was how he kind of saw things either. So we're bringing out these names in order to do that. So when I say that we've got over 1,000 names collected from the archive, that sounds a bit abstract. So how did we do it? This is what the archive looks like. I'm sure you've been in an archive before. So we have the drawers and we have boxes full of material. We would take out, for instance, a postcard or a letter, and we would look for the names as part of the cataloguing process. So who is it from, who is it to? And that gets entered into a spreadsheet. So from the very abstract 1,000 names, we've got very concrete tasks which are taking a lot of time. So we've been running the volunteer project now for just over a year to get to this point. And then it's from these catalogues, I then extract all the names, and we've got volunteer researchers who are looking people up. And we can organise the people of Avebury into different groups. This is just one way of thinking about them. So there are people who are associated with Harold and Florence St George Grey. There's a lovely picture here of Florence and Lionel Grey. So they were excavating at Avebury between 1907 and 1922. Thank you, Prue. And we have a lot of Grey's correspondence and his excavation notes as well, because Alexander Keiller was very much in touch with Harold St George Grey, and so he sort of adopted much of his archive. So we're working with those materials. The bulk of the material and the bulk of the names are associated with this second kind of time period. So Alexander Keiller's staff, his hands, which is what he called his workers, so from the kind of naval term. We have experts and correspondents sending lots of letters about finds. And of course we have lots of local people. As a lot of you are probably very familiar, like Alexander Keiller was very involved in like buying up land around Avebury, so we have a lot of correspondence between landowners and him as well. And then we have people who come into the archive a bit later, so looking into the 1950s and 60s, and that's from material associated with William Young and with Denis Grant King. And these were both men who worked with Keiller, but then stayed at Avebury afterwards, involved in the running of the museum in different ways. So when we're researching these names and finding out about these people, you know, why are we doing it? Why would we put all this effort into these 1,000 names? So this is an example of the British Museum and the way that they give information about their donors and about people associated with different objects. So we're imagining that when our digital archive goes online, you'll be able to look at a letter, see who it's from, see who it's to, and then be able to click on their names and find out just a couple of sentences about that person. So yeah, the British Museum, they put a very short biography about all of the people who are associated with their collection. So this is our aim as well. So I've told you about the way that we collect the names from the letters in the catalogue, but another really important set of sources for us are the diaries, which were kept by Alexander Keiller, Denis Grant King, and William Young. So the two diaries on the left, they're from the Alexander Keiller Museum collection, and then William Young's diaries are housed here at Wiltshire Museum. And I thought I would just give you an overview about how these diaries are different. I could say a lot more about them, but in a nutshell, from Alexander Keiller, we have what he referred to as excavation logs and also plotting books. So these are sort of quite sparse in their details. He tends to not write in full sentences. Generally, at the start of the excavations, you can perhaps see a lot more enthusiasm where he will fill up all of the day, whereas as we go forward in time, he tends to write less and less. And he has listed sort of names and initials will kind of appear throughout the diary. So Alexander Keiller, as kind of head of the project, financing the project, these were his records. But when you actually bring his diaries together with the other ones, you start to realise, okay, he wasn't on site all the time running the project. There were lots of other people who were involved in actually making this excavation happen. Another set of diaries which is super important for us are by Denis King. So King was an artist, actually, and he was, for reasons which remain mysterious to us at the moment, I'm looking for Andrew, because this is his mission at the moment, is to find out why exactly he was so interested in Avebury. We haven't worked it out yet. He was living in London, and he turns up in 1938, desperate to work at Avebury. And he keeps, we have 9 manuscripts by him, and 3 of them are kind of first draft, and 4 of them seem to be a neater draft, telling the same story but with a little bit more embellishment. He also has these gorgeous drawings throughout. I think we'll have to do another event about Denis King, because his drawings are absolutely beautiful. And he really blends together this kind of storytelling. He'll tell you about going on a walk to the Devil's Den and imagining encountering Macbeth's witches up on the Ridgeway. And then the next minute he's back into archaeology and just giving us kind of very scientific information about pottery and flints. So he kind of moves in very interesting genres across his book. And in many ways he kind of shares some sensibilities, I think, with William Young, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And then we have William Young's diaries. We're only looking at a few of William Young's diaries. So the Wiltshire Museum actually hold 81 volumes of his diaries. And volunteers at Devices had actually transcribed up to, I think, diary 19. There was a project a few years ago to do that. But there's kind of all the rest still to do. And we're just looking at a chunk. Originally I thought, let's do them all. But this is just the chunk of time where WEVY is at Avebury and excavations are actually happening. As Prue will kind of explain, I think he does tend to keep referring back in time in all of his diaries. So as we get into the 1940s and 1950s, he still does sometimes reference the past. But we just decided to keep this little chunk here. So maybe there's a future project with all of the rest of the WEVY material, so William Young material. And yeah, it's really key that we have him, because without William Young's diaries, they're almost like a key, really, that brings this extra richness and detail to Alexander Keiller's writing and Denis King's. So just as an example, this is a close-up of Alexander Keiller's 1934 diary. And on one of the first pages, he has a list of his ratings, which is another word he uses for his workers. And you can see he's listed all of their last names, mostly. We might get an initial here and there, and the day that they started. And then as we go through the diary, he does make reference to the re-erecting gang or people putting up fences, but he might not necessarily use people's names. Whereas in William Young's diaries, and this is from covering the same time period, we have the list of names here, and we've got first initials. Aha, brilliant. So we can now start to build a bit more detail about these people, because as you can imagine, last names like Pierce, Hambridge, Pratt, Gale, if you type those into Find My Past or Ancestry, and you look at the Wiltshire area, you have a bunch of possible candidates, whereas William Young has allowed us to really narrow down and identify which men in particular were at these excavations. Not only does William Young give us first initials, he will quite often also give us a little bit of extra detail into these men's lives. So here we've got Richard Ball, and he tells us he's one of the refilling gang, excellent, and he's been given a few days' leave of absence to go and thatch Mr. Pete Garland's hayricks. So we know he's a thatcher. So we can start then to really confirm the evidence from different places as to who these people are. Volunteer researchers have found that the excavators in census records, sometimes they would put themselves down as excavators or archaeological workers, but a lot of the time they would put their main profession, so they put thatcher or farmhand. And so having this information really helps us pin down the right person. As another example of how William Young is our key, Alexander Keiller's handwriting is hard. It takes a little while to get your eye in. So when we first started transcribing, which is copying out the writing. We have a system where if you're not sure, you put in a question mark. So in January and February and March last year, the transcriptions that we made then have a lot of question marks. So we're now in the process of going back through them and adding in details. And one place where we had a question mark, and it was very lucky that the same person spotted these words. So Prue was transcribing May 1938, and we had this new name come up. We were like, oh, we think David is on site, and David is helping to excavate stones. Okay, let's add him to the list. Strange to not have a last name. If we look at William Young's diary, Prue noticed, and thank goodness you can hold these things in your brain, many months later, that it's Druid. And so that helps us, and now when you see it, you know, it makes sense. So this is really useful for being able to train people on Alexander Keiller's handwriting, because you can say, that's an R, that's an R. And it turns out, you know, Druid, strange name for a person, this is Druid, Druid is the fourth. And we have photographs in the archive. So this is, you know, another kind of example of how these archival materials kind of come together. So that picture of Druid is just one of many. So we've actually got 8 photo albums, and each album has got about 100 pictures covering the excavations from 1934 and 1935 on West Kennet Avenue, and then from 1937 to 1939 in the 3 sectors of Avebury. And yeah, they're amazing in many ways. You get all of these figures, you get a behind-the-scenes look at the excavation. However, very few of the photographs have got any captions on them. You occasionally get an initial, but otherwise we don't really have any idea as to who these people are. So these were put together by Alexander Keiller and Stuart Pigott. But in WEVY's diaries, we have names. So he's very meticulous in the way that he will add captions to his photographs. And again, Prue has been in the library here at Devizes, going through and re-photographing the photos that have got captions on them. Because we have some of these prints in the Alexander Keiller Museum archive, so we can start to say, this is this person. Haven't quite figured out yet how we're going to try and ID all of the other photos, but it'll be a good game of kind of spot the difference and guess who to try and name everybody. Because something which we hope to do at the end of this project, so next summer, is to have some kind of exhibition at Avebury where we have photographs from the excavations, and it would just be really lovely to be able to say kind of who's who. Even if we can say this shows a stone being re-erected and we know that these 4 men were involved in the re-erection, so it must be one of them. So that's kind of the detail that we need. Okay, and this is where I actually need to read some notes about William Young before I hand over to Bev and Prue. So let me just find my place. So I'm going to give you some very bare bones details about WEVY before it kind of gets filled in. So just to kind of orient ourselves, William Young, born William, Edward was his original name. William Edward Young. Vincent comes in. Or Edward William Young, even. The V sneaks in. Ask about that afterwards. So he was born on 26th of September 1890, and he died in 1971, the last of 5 generations of blacksmiths in Ebbesbourne Wake. And he was very close in age then, pretty much contemporary with Alexander Keiller, who was born in December 1889. But they were on very different social levels. That's a kind of basic thing to say about them. So as Bev and Prue have been finding in their research, in many ways WEVY benefits from a little bit of what we might call social mobility, but in other ways he never really forgets his position either. He was a member of the Wiltshire Archaeological and Natural History Society since 1928 until his death in 1971. And we actually, the information that we have about him, some of it comes from the 2 obituaries which were published in Wands. And I must also mention, I've not written her name down. So Barbara Fuller and Peter Mears as well have done research on WEVY, which hasn't been published in the instance of Barbara Fuller, but those notes are super useful for us. So he served in the army in World War I, and he began his archaeological career once he returned to England. And his association with Avebury begins in the 1920s, when Harold St George Grey recruits William Young as the foreman for the Windmill Hill excavations. And he returns to work with Alexander Keiller in 1934. And from then on, he's more or less permanently employed, so at the excavations as foreman, but then he stays and is one of the first curators of the museum until his retirement in the 1960s. So I don't want to say much more than that, but what I will say as well as a tease, which we won't be able to go into today, but what Mark is finding, so Mark Gillings, is not only are these diaries extremely rich resources for telling us about the culture and society of the 1930s and 40s, they're actually archaeologically extremely significant too. So volunteers have transcribed basically all of the relevant diaries now, and Mark and Ben have been going through them and finding that William Young has made more precise recordings about where particular artefacts were found than Alexander Keiller did. And it seems as though Isabel Smith, who did the big Avebury book in the 1960s, might have skipped over some of that detail as well, because she was more interested in the kind of big picture, whereas WEVY is so granular that's really helping Ben and Mark to bring together the excavations from the 1930s with the excavations that they did a few years ago as part of the Living with Monuments project, which some of you might know about. So they're going to be publishing that information with information from more recent excavations, because the way that Mark puts it is William Young makes notes in the same way that we do today. It's that level of detail. So I will now hand over to Bev, who will tell us a bit more about William Young.
Okay. Here we go. Right. I got involved with this project from working at Avebury as a room guide. And then suddenly this project appeared, and I took a look at it, and I thought to myself, yes, this looks really interesting to me. I'm not an archaeologist. I've got nothing to do with archaeology, really, and so I must apologise if I make any big archaeological bloomers in the next few minutes or so. My background is history. I was a history teacher for nearly 40 years, and this is what attracted me to this particular project. Because as a history teacher, you spend all your time with secondary sources. You're looking at what how historians have summed up their discoveries. And a lot of the time you're dealing with school textbooks, which are, sort of breaking down of that material there. Here was an opportunity to get in with the primary source material. And so I sort of signed up, and Fran pointed me into looking at all sorts of different things. One of the things Fran's been really good at is making sure that we never get a chance to get bored, because we always get a chance to look at lots of different things. So the sorts of jobs I've been doing is a lot of diary transcribing, and that will be the core of what I'm going to talk about now. Cataloguing letters and photos and so forth. I was involved early on in the photographing of part of the archive. And the most recent thing I've been involved in has been the people research, trying to find out about people like Maud Cunnington, for example, who obviously has a big connection with where we are at the moment there. What I'm going to focus on today is W.E.V. Young's diaries, and particularly his 1939 diary, which is what I've spent the last few months really taking a look at. One thing I would say, for everything I'm going to show you during the course of today, this is what I've seen. This is my particular perspective from what's in front of me. There are loads of volunteers I can see around the place here, and every one of them could probably stand up here and give you a completely different picture of what happened. I'm sure we'd agree on what Young is like, but our experience of him would be rather different from what we've actually taken a look at. When you look at his diaries, they fall into two sections, really. Most of it is the working week. It's Monday to lunchtime on Saturday. That's the working week there. And that is where the hardcore archaeological stuff comes. To archaeologists, this is what really matters. As Fran just said there, this is where they're going to find so much more to add to the picture. From my point of view, it needs doing, but it's not the most exciting thing in the world. I get really excited when the weekend comes along. Because at the weekend, WEVY, as we like to call him, does all sorts of weird and wonderful things. It's Saturday afternoon, it's Sunday. Sometimes he gets an extension to about lunchtime on Monday to get back from wherever he's been. And the three different things he gets up to, most weekends, he spends in Avebury. He's there in Avebury, he will go for a walk on the Ridgeway, he might go and see some friends, you know, go for a cup of tea or something, or with somebody. And on other occasions, he just stays in his room writing. You know, you get these entries, Sunday, weather, stormy, carried on writing, full stop. And that's all there is to it, right? That's his day, that's his Sunday. He also, about once a month, or every 6 weeks, he goes back to his home in Ebbesbourne. And they are really interesting when he goes to his home, because it's almost like this man who has climbed the social scale and he's become quite sophisticated, and then he goes home and he just slips straight back into the rural labour background that he has actually come from. He goes back to mother and dad, you know, both his mum and dad are alive there, and he is, I would say, reverential towards them. He really does look up to them and he treats them with enormous reverence there. He gets back there, if harvest on, he just goes off and helps with the harvest. He'll dig in the garden, or the thing I find absolutely, you know, amazing, he will just go out for a walk and he'll just call in on people he knows. Calls in, you know, nobody's expecting him to arrive, you know, he just appears there and starts chatting and goes away afterwards and writes, and they were really pleased to see me. And that comes in every time there. Oh, they were so delighted to see me. And what I love about it is my father came from Cornwall, and he was also started as an agricultural labourer as well. And when he used to drag us down to Cornwall to go and see things, the first thing we did was we travelled around to see all these relatives and people we never knew at the time. And he would never announce beforehand he was coming, you just turned up. You wouldn't do that nowadays, but it shows you the different world we're living in. What I'm going to focus on in a few minutes is the third thing he does. Every now and then, and it is quite rare, we're talking about, you know, a time when it was difficult to get around, people didn't have cars of their own, he'll go on an exciting day trip. And as I say, I'm going to focus on those. One thing's worth saying at this stage, going back to those sort of weekday diaries, Fran has referred to how sort of meticulous he is in his diaries. This is just an extract from one page. If you take a look at it, every one of those numbers is actually the weight of a packing stone. Right? It comes, you know, they do a bit of digging, they come across a bunch of packing stones, which were the stones which were originally put to hold the Sarsens up. And the first thing he does is he takes every one and measures them. And you will find this right throughout the diary. That's the level of detail this man is looking at. I'm going to focus on 4 little events during 1939. Young's bad day out in June 1939. The trip he makes down to Downside Abbey with mum and dad. The infamous necromancer, and his reactions to the outbreak of war in 1939. So, his bad day out. He plans a day out. He goes, Denis King goes, Mr. and Mrs. Cook. Mr. Cook is also an archaeologist there, and their son Charles. They go on this trip out to Stanton Drew. Many of you will probably know Stanton Drew, down southwest of Bristol, near to Chew Valley. A stone circle like Stonehenge and Avebury, etc. They head down there, and then afterwards they go to Cheddar. Disaster strikes. Right, they arrive down there, and he says in his diary, and I'd like to sort of use his own voice, it simply poured in torrents when we arrived there, and we began to think we had made the journey in vain. But after having partaken of our lunch in the car, it cleared up and the sun shone out. We then walked round the village to find, to our great disappointment, that the whole of these megalithic remains, which are situated in 3 separate enclosures, are closed to the public on Sundays. We managed to get a distant view of them, however, from the meadow northeast of the church. So all that distance down there and the place is shut. If you go there now, if you go there nowadays, it's open all the time. You just need to go through a little gate and there's like an honesty box. Pop it in there and you're in. Remember, it's Sunday. It's his day off, right? He's going to just do a little bit of sightseeing. But the archaeological WEVY is never far away, right? He's recording the number of feet between the stones there, the details. And his brain works like that all the time. I think what we have actually said many times, when he goes to Ebbesbourne, he doesn't just give you a description of going to Ebbesbourne, he tells you what time he caught the bus in Marlborough, what time they got into Salisbury, what time they picked up the bus again in Salisbury, and then what time they caught the bus arrived in Ebbesbourne. And his brain is like that. He's just an absolute stickler for detail. This is what he saw, right? If you've been to Stanton Drew, you come in nowadays down through there, that's where the honesty box is, and you walk straight in and have a good wander around. He, because they must have in those days, they must have had it controlled more. So he tends to see what he's talking about from this distance here. He's looking at it from the outside. It must have been so frustrating for him. You know, this was something he was really looking forward to going to see, and he doesn't get in to see it. That's what it looks like today, right? I took that photograph last year. It's not quite the view that WEVY would have. WEVY was looking from that direction. But that looks at one of the stone circles there. I will say at this point, but I'm not going to explain it to you, there's a very interesting story of Stanton Drew which connects it with the circus in Bath. Right? If you want to know about that, ask later. Okay? And there's a close-up of the stones, you know, as they look today. Quite similar to the ones we see at Avebury, but if you look at the material, slightly different. You see the reddish stone that you start to get as you move down through Somerset. At that point, they decide to call it a day and move on to Cheddar. Let's go and see Cheddar. Well, the bad day hasn't stopped yet. At Cheddar, we spent an hour in the gorge, although it was not by any means the best season in which to see it. Not because of the vast crowds of trippers, but because of the cheap jack commercialisation which is carried on there in every shape and form by the natives during the tourist season. To see the gaudy erections like the fountains and the caveman's restaurant outside Guts Cave that mar the beauty of this lovely gorge is enough to make any Englishman blush from very shame. We did not feel disposed to have our tea in the much advertised caveman's restaurant, so waited until we reached Wells. And then he goes on and has strawberries and cream. Right? You know, I'm really intrigued by this, and I'm speculating here, but this to me seems like a man who is making his way up the social scale, and he's looking at, he's read, maybe he's heard Keiller sort of denouncing things like this, and he's thinking, this is what you think, this is what you say when you get to the level of that level of things. Possibility, it's speculation. There's the caveman's reference. I think it's beautiful. You know, Art Deco, it's very much of its style there. You know, it's a lovely little building there.
Is it still there?
It's still there, but I think it's been covered up by things and whatever there. It doesn't quite look as it did originally. To be honest, I don't think WEVY was so much worried about the architecture. I think it's just the name, Caveman's Restaurant, which is really upsetting as such. But anyway, number 2. A couple of weeks later, he goes off and does another trip. But this time, he goes along, he brings Mother and Dad somebody called Bert, who you'll know who he is.
Little brother.
His little brother, thank you very much. Right, he takes them to go down into Somerset. There's Mother, and she's always referred to as Mother. Every few pages of his diary, wrote to Mother, received a letter from Mother, and that's Dad there. The other people, somebody might actually mention those later on, or you could ask about them. We do know who they are, okay? They're going down to Downside Abbey, which is a Catholic abbey in Somerset between Midsummer Norton and Shepton Mallet. WEVY was Catholic. He was a Catholic convert. And he took his religion very, very seriously. He was very serious about it. And he had a strong connection with a man called Abbot Horn, who was the titular abbot of Glastonbury Abbey, right? And Abbot Horn was also an archaeologist as well. So they had a very strong connection between them. And they go down to see Abbot Horn, because Abbot Horn is going to show them around this wonderful monastery. It's a big thing for Mother and Father, because you're dealing again with a rural population who would rarely have got out of their villages, and they're going down to see somewhere they wouldn't normally see. Because they arrive too early, they stop off at Radstock to look at the coalfields. And he says there in the diary there, Mother had never seen the coalfields before, so this would have been quite a sight for them. Go there nowadays and all you see is fields and beautifully covered pit tips and whatever. There's Downside Abbey. It was only 4 years old when he's visiting, right? You can see it, it's almost sort of modelled on those French Gothic cathedrals from the 13th, 14th centuries there. When they get down there, Abbot Horn shows them round. This is a tiny extract of an account which takes 4 or 5 pages where he describes everything in the diary. And you get the level of detail here. Father Horn then took us all around the Abbey Church and described the various features in turn, beginning with the chapel of St Lawrence, then the altar and shrine of the Blessed Oliver Plunkett in the north transept and the beautiful Lady Chapel. Mother and the others were completely spellbound at the sight of the lovely works of art and the wonderful features of historical interest. And that enthusiasm carries all the way through. And he's interested in everything. He's got a really sort of strong interest and knowledge of church architecture, etc. And he's overwhelmed by it. He says his parents are overwhelmed by it. They have a really good day out this time. This is nice. Dad was a sort of rural labourer, etc., but he was a blacksmith as well. And while he's there, Dad was particularly interested in the wrought ironwork and the wonderful carvings there. So there's something there for Dad to be interested. In the later part of the diary there, Abbot Horn actually asked Dad if he'll make some gates for the nearby church. But Dad gets WEVY to write back and say, sorry, I can't, I'm too old now. And there it is, where they're going next. After having been to Downside Abbey and having a wonderful time there, he takes them back to Cheddar again, despite his hatred of the caveman's restaurants. And this is a really interesting account as he goes through, because he's basically showing his parents, this is where I used to work. 10 years before, he was involved in various digs in various places, including in Somerset. And he recalls one of his exciting moments when he was working there in 1926. Soldier's Hole. The cave is a short distance above Guff's cave, on the same side of the gorge. I found it one Sunday afternoon when I slipped off a narrow ledge above it and fell into some bushes which grew in front of it. The mouth of the cave was completely hidden by ivy which hung down over it. I went inside and picked up a number of sherds of ornamental pottery of the Lake Village Wookey Hole type, which were actually lying in the surface. These sherds, blah, 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 blah. So he's thinking back to his early experiences as a young archaeologist in the 1920s. He was also involved in one of the really big archaeological digs at that time, the Iron Age Beer Lake Village dig which took place. And he says there, Chelm's Coombe I pointed out Chelmscombe to them, also the vicarage where I used to stay sometimes when excavating in Somerset. I generally spent alternate weekends there and at the manor with Mr. and Mrs. R.F. Parry during the Mere Lake Village excavations. I spent 9 seasons at Mere altogether. So he put a lot of time and effort into that particular dig. Right, third one, the infamous necromancer. This is a diary entry on July 1939, and he writes, "Wrote to Mother and also to the Right Reverend Abbot Horn. In my letter to Abbot Horn, I enclosed a cutting from the Psychic News, which Mr. Keiller asked me to send him, as the cutting contained a most impudent and lying statement about him, arising out of the utter humbug practised by that infamous impostor Bligh Bond and his brother necromancers at Glastonbury, and Mr. Keiller thought he ought to see it." So we've got a scandal coming up here. Bligh Bond, the infamous necromancer. There is the Psychic News. I challenged the Daily Mail. Couldn't have been all bad, could it? Bligh Bond, who was he? Well, to start with, he actually was very important. He actually was a skilled man. He began as an architect. He built loads of buildings. There's a lot of buildings in Bristol and around the university in Bristol and also in Bath, which were his buildings. He knew what he was doing. He was an expert. He was an expert in church architecture. Only yesterday I found online some pictures that he'd drawn of church architecture, and they're the most beautiful drawings there. He was the director of excavations at Glastonbury between 1908 to 21. But in the background, he had other ways of thinking at the world, and these caused him problems by the time it got to 1921. He was interested in something called gematria. Gematria, right? Now, I don't know a great deal about gematria. It's basically looking at sentences, words, etc., teasing out numbers from them. Those numbers underlie all the ideas lying there, and then they hold secret knowledge as such. The best example I can actually give is back in the 17th century, when the Civil War was about to take place. William Laud was the bishop who was hated by the Puritans more than anybody else. And one Puritan cleric took William Laud, put it into Roman numerals, added it all up, and what number did it come up with? You can probably guess. 666, right? It all added up to 666. So he believes that lying behind all these words and all these sentences, there's a sort of hidden numerical thing. He also came to the conclusion that he could communicate with dead monks. Right? He got a lot of his knowledge, he thought, about Glastonbury. He's trying to search for some chapels, the Edgar Chapel there, for example. And he starts to do, he gets a medium to communicate with these monks. And it's hilarious what he's doing with these monks. Not only is he communicating with the monks sometimes speak to him in Latin, they sometimes speak to him in Old English, they sometimes speak to him in Modern English. They also quarrel with one another over what they're telling him. So it's a really peculiar storyline there. And you can see the man we're talking about. He was in the Freemasons, he was in the Theosophical Society, which I think was connected with Madame Blavatsky. I don't know if you've come across. Very, very famous back in the early 20th century. Turns up in The Wasteland, T.S. Eliot's poem. The Society for Psychical Research, the Societas Rosicruciana, which must be the Rosicrucians, or another one of those strange societies back then, the Ghost Club. And then he decamps to America, where he's made a bishop in the Old Catholic Church of America, which has got nothing to do with the Catholic Church. It's a new one. So this is a peculiar man indeed. And he ends up in a huge dispute with Abbot Horn. In fact, when this letter's being written, he's trying to actually sue Abbot Horn. Abbot Horn simply responds to all these sort of things that are being said. He's a bit more sort of cool about it than WEVY is. I do not think that the rag in which the libel appears is worth taking any notice of. And he then goes on, the growth of the apps shows how Bond's ideas expand as they go on. He's basically saying he's making it up as he goes along, all this sort of business going on. But Abbot Horn has a little bit of a sting in the tail. I've not made up my mind yet what I should say, but it will be much worse than what I have already said. I'd love to know where it goes from there, but it's sort of left hanging in the diary at that stage. He's not forgotten in Glastonbury. If you sort of go from Wells and take the sort of ring road round the end of Glastonbury, you'll find this new housing estate. And it's Bly Bond Road, right? So, you know, he's clearly, maybe because of his early role in the excavations of Glastonbury, maybe he actually has got a good reputation in certain areas there. This is Abbot Horn, who looks to me like one of the dead monks in that picture. That's probably a bit rude to say about it. Anyway, finally, the reactions to the war. One thing you don't get much of in Weavy's diaries is reference to current affairs. Very occasionally he'll suddenly mention these darkening times or the difficult international situation, but most of the diary is just doing his job down there. There is one lovely little bit in August of 1939 when the army park on West Kennet Avenue. They park there, Keiller goes storming up there to deal with it. He gets promises from the officer in charge that everything will be left properly. Keiller's quite happy. The army take off, they clear all the rubbish away, and a day later Weevy goes up there and discovers that some of the squaddies have actually carved their initials into the stones. Oh. So he goes mental at that point. Here are just 3 reactions, and they show different sides to Weevy in each one. His stiff upper lip, right? This is the day that war is declared. And he says there, it is indeed a terrible thing that so many thousands of innocent souls should be called upon to suffer all the agonies of war through the madness of one man. But it is time that madman was stopped. And our cause is just, so we have nothing to fear, since it has become quite clear that nothing can satisfy his craving lust for still more domination over mankind. So it could come out one of those sort of propaganda movies from the war, couldn't it? He's expressing the views there. But remember, Weevy knew war. He had been in the First World War, and he actually fought in Mesopotamia and was involved in the relief of the siege of Kut, which took place in 1916. So he's not, this isn't abstract to him. He will have the memories there. A few weeks later, Russia invades eastern Poland as a result of the Nazi-Soviet pact there. And at this point, he's basically saying, well, we don't know what's going to happen. So every day is something dreadful happening. All we can do is hope for the best while being prepared for the worst in these days of insincerity and hypocrisy. So again, there's his indignation coming out. And then there's a lovely one here where they're talking about part of the excavations running down. This is the last year of the excavations. And he says here, it was decided to carry on with the repairing of Stone 4 since we have brought our work up close and cannot dispense with our hands very well until they have have some other work to go to of national importance. He is thinking of his hands. If they're laid off now, how are they going to earn their living? So, he's given the advice, let's just keep the digging going, and then eventually these hands will be called up into the forces or some other national work. He's thinking of them, and you find that all the way through the diaries. He comes from the same background as his men, and even though he's now their foreman, he hasn't forgotten what it's like to be one of those men. Finally, this is my interpretation of Weevy, having spent a year with him almost. My thoughts about him. He's a very dedicated man. He's meticulous. The accuracy of this man, the care he takes with things. He is a professional. He's obviously of a rural working class background, but he's aspirational. is very much of that 20th century people moving up the social scale and moving forward. Yet, as Fran alluded to earlier, he's socially uncertain. You know, he realises he is not of the class of Keiller and Lord Cunnington. And there's various places where he almost seems to be aping what they're thinking and saying, because he thinks that's what you do when you get to this level. So there's that uncertainty lying there. He retains his connection throughout with his roots, and you see that with his dealings with mother and dad and the other people there. As we've just seen, he's compassionate. He's very, very caring. And I find him a very likeable character. He's somebody, you know, you think, yeah, I could have got on with this chap. As I put that, unlike Keiller. But I won't say anything about that now. Okay?
Thank you very much, Bev. So, if you have your questions, save them to the end and write them down as well so you don't forget them and we can collect them. I'm now going to hand over to Prue, who will take you through a little bit more of kind of WEVY after the excavations, before the excavations. So, as I mentioned, for the Avebury Papers project, we're focused just on the kind of excavation years for the diaries. However, through her research, Prue is finding that the diaries from the earlier and later periods are really important for kind of understand WEVY as the man, as the archaeologist, but also for giving us that extra detail of kind of how he works. So I'll hand over to you, Prue. Thank you.
I've never used one of these things before, so forgive me if I make a few mistakes. I've been looking at WEVY. I've been coming down to the museum and reading the diaries that go beyond what we're looking at now, because he does stay at Avebury in various capacities through the war and then out the other side, always in the museum, and it's just a continuation, though he does stop being an active archaeologist to a large degree. There are occasions when he will be called to look at something and he gets a chance to just potter about a little bit, which you can tell he really relishes. It's unfortunate for him that the war happened when it did, as it's unfortunate for the rest of the Avebury project, because it did sort of put a stop to his archaeological career. He was born in 1890, as has been said, so he was getting on a bit, and he was never in the best of health. He did suffer quite a lot from ill health. And seems to have been a little bit mentally fragile at times as well. So I'm looking forward there. He wrote, as Fran said, there are 81 volumes of his diaries in the custody of Wiltshire Museum. He chose to give them to the Wiltshire Museum as a very much a last-minute thought in his will. Denis King, who's been mentioned before, who was one of his best friends in the latter part of his life, was left in charge of his diaries. And in his will, he had decided that he had fallen out with the other people at Avebury Museum, which was then run by the Ministry of Works, and it has to be said, the National Trust. And he had constant gripes and moans with both of those organisations. So he wasn't going to leave his diaries to the Avebury Museum, the Keiller Museum. So he then thought he would leave them to the Ashmolean in Oxford. And luckily for us, he suddenly changed his mind, and right at the end of his life, he put it in his will that he wanted them to come here. So we've been very fortunate in that they're now very much accessible through the kindness of the museum, and I've been coming here and looking at them on a regular basis. So he wrote almost daily for 35 years, from 1930 until 1965. He was 75 years old by that stage and had just retired his curatorship of Avebury Museum. So it seemed to him a logical time to stop. I haven't actually got as far as reading the last one. I'm saving that little gem for later, but no doubt he'll have something interesting to say. He was a compulsive writer, absolutely compulsive, and an extensive note-taker too. He recorded, as everybody's said, many aspects of his life in very great detail, and that's what makes it such an enormously valuable record of not only the archaeology, but of his time. I always thought I wouldn't be interested in the history of the 20th century because I've lived through nearly half of it, but in actual fact, I'm finding it absolutely fascinating to relate to the bits that I can relate to, and to see the lives of my parents and grandparents reflected in WEVY's experience. That's a very different way of coming at history. My particular interest is genealogy, which is why I got into this project, because I knew there was going to be a people research side to it. And I thought, ooh, yeah, I'd like to do that. And boy, was I right. It's been great. Anyway, he always writes fluently. I think you've probably gathered that. We've had extracts read already. He writes really well. He was educated in the village school in Ebbesbourne Wake. I've actually found a record. I did give it to Fran, actually, but we decided we weren't going to show it. But I found a record of his school admission. He went to school, if they've got their records right, the day before his 3rd birthday. Yes, now actually I think they've got it wrong, because they put his birthday down as the 25th of November and he started school at September. He started school supposedly on the 25th of September 1893. Now I think they probably mean the 26th. I haven't checked what day of the week it was actually, because that might make a difference. Maybe they did let him in a day early. But that is, it wouldn't have been a creche, it would have been a village school. The older girls would probably have taught and looked after the young children. He's not the only one who started school when he was 3. Very interesting. So statutory school leaving age then was 14, and they would have left that school at 14. So he had, 11 years at school. And he was a Victorian. I mean, he went to a Victorian school, and the teaching was rigorous. It's no wonder that he is a very capable writer. But he also has this great village tradition as a raconteur. He tells a brilliant story. And he's actually got a lot of this from, now what do I do next? Hang on a minute. Oh no. Oh, what's this one? Do we know? He got a lot of his storytelling prowess from his grandfather. This is his grandfather, Samuel Maidment, who is his maternal grandfather. And that's him at the age of 92. Doing a little bit of scything. He was very active. He didn't die till he was 97. And he seems to be, every photograph he looks happy. Unlike with his mother, who every photograph she looks really miserable. Don't know why that is, because WEVY seems to be happy. Maybe it skips a generation, I don't know. And so, but I think he looks vaguely familiar. Anybody see that? So do we have the Wiltshire side there? Yes, I don't see why not. And this is one of the photographs that WEVY took. WEVY took photographs wherever he went. And he used to develop his own photographs. He would sometimes colour tint them. He even took photographs during the First World War, apparently. He writes about that. But none of them have survived, I don't think. We need to really scour the archives, I think, and have a good look for those. The archaeological detail in his diary suggests that a lot of it was written on the site. He must have made notes on site. And then he later copied it all out. It's too neat. All his diaries are incredibly neat. There are no deletions. Well, just occasionally you get a strike through a whole paragraph which is actually wrong. He's discovered that what he's written is wrong. He will just strike it through with a single line. It's not in any way untidy. He's meticulous. And so we know that he was writing notes and then copying them up later. As you said, Bev, he will spend a Sunday writing. He's writing. He writes an enormous amount of letters to an enormous amount of people, great at keeping in contact. But of course the postal service was much better than it is now, and so you could rely on people getting things fairly quickly. Alexander Keiller initially had some of his diaries bound into book form, and that's like the regular form. Did we put that one in? It's the regular format that we see now. This is what they all look like. How you managed to do that over a period of, 35 years? I'm not quite sure. I did find one the other day, and when you open the inside cover, it says 2 and 9pence in pencil. But the first ones were bound at Keiller's request, because he wanted him to be able to give him notes. This is what WEVY did. Every dig that he went on, and he went on loads and loads and loads of digs, which is going to come out. We're currently working on a calendar so that we can see exactly where he went when. And he didn't just work for Keiller, he worked for an awful lot of significant archaeologists in the whole of Wessex, the Wessex area. And he used to write his notes, and then he would send his books, his notes, to the director of the dig, who would use that to write his report. There are a few instances of Weaver getting no further than writing on the scraps of paper. So this is the sort of rough notes he's making. These are obviously sheets from an exercise book, but this one here, on that side there, was one that was written when he was actually hospitalised in 1945. He was very, very busy during the Second World War. There was a period where he hardly wrote the diary at all. He was engaged in the Home Guard, and of course, WEVY being WEVY, there'll be a bit more about that later. He was madly organising everything, writing lots of stuff, and also there may have been a shortage of paper, so he didn't really write his diaries a lot between 1941 and 1943. There is a bit of a gap. But this one here, he was hospitalised. He had a perforated ulcer, which was his mother had a perforated ulcer. It seemed to be a family thing, and they didn't really look after themselves in terms of when and what they ate. Weavy was not very good at looking after himself, and he got ill a lot, basically. This was a complete crisis, and he was hospitalised for 6 weeks, had to go on a milk diet. It sounds absolutely ghastly. And so his diaries didn't get written up. They stayed in these sheets of paper for several weeks. And then when he got better, he started writing in his books again. So it's uncharacteristic for him to stop, but he does occasionally. Now, I'd like to go back to the spring of 1931. Now, we've been talking about the young Weavy. Actually, in 1931, which is, he'd started his career, but he was actually 41. He was in 1931. So he's not a youngster, he's not a child. We do find that although his reputation was secure, he actually still wasn't able to support himself with a reliable income from archaeology. So he went back to Ebbesbourne Wake one weekend, and this is the diary that he wrote. Weather fine with a strong southwest wind, started hoeing mangolds for Uncle Enos in the field just below Swallow Cliff Corner. Uncle Enos had a farm, that sounds like a song, and he really was employed, when he was at home, he was employed around the place, gardening jobs, working on farms in the area, lots of different people he mentions that he worked for. Had a letter from Mr. Keiller, which with reference to the best means of preserving my diary for future generations. At the moment, it seems to me almost absurd that there should be any value in it, considering the fact that I'm now forced to do casual farm work in order to eke out an existence. After 10 years' experience in archaeological work, I've come to the conclusion that it is very well for those who can afford to spend their whole time at it, but rather hopeless for anyone like myself. In the past 6 months, my earnings have not averaged £1 a week. And for 3 months previous to this, I had no excavation work to do. Not that I'm losing interest in archaeology, far from it. But while I have to hunt about for means of a living, I get very little time to think about it. My letters and other writings have to be done often when I'm dead tired after a day's work in the field or garden. It is nearly midnight as I write this entry. But he's still got time to write to Mr. Dewar and Mrs. Baker. And this is Weavy all over. It's very interesting. This actually illustrates the state of archaeology in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. It was still the preserve of the wealthy, educated, time-rich upper middle classes and all the gentry and the clerics, the sort of people who actually created museums like this one and the societies that went with them. Weavy, with his solid roots and his country ways, he had, according to Denis Grant-King, he had a slight Wiltshire burr, he had the accent, he didn't quite fit in, and as Bev has said, he was never going to get into the upper echelons of society. He wasn't going to cross that barrier. But he did manage to work his way up to being indispensable to all these archaeologists. It was at a crossroads where people were starting to go on courses for archaeology. There were students of archaeology, and there were also the great, there were some, dilettantes, if you like, and then there were the more knowledgeable ones, like the more experienced ones, like Harold Gray and the Cunningtons, obviously. So there's a sort of crossover going on here. WEVY doesn't quite fit into any of it because he's pushing himself through this. He's a very strange and special man. His obsession is he is an obsessional character, and his knowledge of archaeology is based on his background as a country boy, living where he did, which is an area which is full of archaeology. He used to go flinting all the time with, there was an old vicar called the Reverend Selby. He used to take him out. They used to go off on bike rides and go flinting. He knew what he was looking at. He could read the land, and he would no doubt have dug around and looked at what the soils were, understand where the chalk is, all of those things. It was sort of innate in him as a country person who had the time and the opportunity to really look around himself and really understand what was going on. This is the advantage he had over all these rather she men and women who were, in his view, I imagine, who were organising the digs and things like that. One person who... No, just going to say, I missed a bit out there. So, well, I'm just going to say that in 1931, just after that little rant, I call these little rants for obvious reasons, he has rants all over the place about all sorts of things. He's a very ranty person, and as he gets older, his rants get stronger and stronger until he was a Daily Mail reader, and as Bev said, he seems to be easily influenced. I think he can be influenced, as you were saying, he was influenced by the people who he tries to emulate by being a bit proper. But he was also very ranty in a Daily Mail fashion, and I think he gets a lot of his political opinions from such publications. So he does do Daily Mail rants. Anyway, sorry. In the same year, later on, Alexander Keiller, he must have been very aware of Young's precarious financial position, because he suddenly says, I'm going to give you a winter allowance. And this was the start of the real start of their sort of symbiotic relationship. They had a very, very close relationship, not always easy in any way at all. Sometimes WEVY was very critical of Keiller. Keiller has never written anything down that is particularly critical of WEVY, but I don't know. I haven't seen all the correspondence, so I can't say. But Young was absolutely overjoyed with this opportunity, so that he could then actually write his notes. This is what Keiller wanted him to do. He was paying him ostensibly to write his notes up, so that Keiller had the benefit of all the notes that WEVY was going to write and would have first access to his notebooks. And then he would also have time to pursue his archaeological studies, which is just what he wanted. So over the course of his career, WEVY worked in Wiltshire, Somerset, Devon, Dorset, Hampshire, and a little tiny bit in Surrey. He started working in archaeology at the end, after the First World War, with his great neighbour and friend, Dr. Richard Challoner Cobb Clay, who was a GP. He lived in Fifield Bovant, which is just up the road from Ebbesbourne Wake. These small communities, they would have known each other. They were exactly contemporary, both born and died in the same years, which is curious. And Dr. Clay was a very noted and very capable amateur archaeologist. If you look at the reports that he has written in WAM of the digs that he did in the 1920s, they are very detailed, they are meticulous, and I think that WEVY had this as his influence to be so detailed. Clay's notes are spectacularly detailed. So this is obviously, and Clay is credited with teaching WEVY. Although they were the same age, Clay had obviously had the time and the opportunity to go around his local area and look at the archaeology of the area. And he quickly saw that WEVY was really interested in all this sort of stuff, knew quite a lot because he'd been an observer of the area in the same way, and the two got together, and so WEVY got a very good training with Dr. Clay. It was Clay who organised, when he worked with Clay initially, he was working as a volunteer. He does make that clear. And Clay subsequently recommended him to Harold Gray, who was doing some work in Taunton Castle in November 1923. That was actually the first paid job he did as an archaeologist. It didn't turn out particularly well for him. He didn't get on with Harold Gray terribly well, and they did have quite an interesting, let's say, relationship for quite a long time. But in the end, they made up, and they were all good chums. From that first job, he must have made an impression, because he suddenly started to get other jobs, and he started to gain experience at a very rapid rate. So that within about 3-4 years, 2 years even, Gray was saying to Alexander Keiller, no, if you're going to come help me with Windmill Hill, if we're going to work in this together, you are having WEVY. That's what happened. He said, I won't let you do it, I won't do it unless you bring WEVY in. You can call him WEVY, but if you bring Young in. He was often employed for several consecutive seasons at a time. Like you've said, he worked at the Mere Lake dig for several seasons. So prospective employers had to negotiate dates to get him. And there's lovely letters between Cunnington and Keiller, who Mrs. Cunnington and Mr. Keiller had also a strange relationship, but they were terribly polite to each other, which is rather nice. And they had to negotiate who was going to have WEVY when. That was all quite interesting. Now, WEVY was... What's my next slide? I can't remember. Hang on a minute. Let me have a look. What's that? Oh, yes. That's nice. Right, so this is... This is one of Dorothy Liddell's digs, isn't it? Yes. WEVY was the link between the dig directors and the men who did the shifting and lifting, and they respected him, as you've already said, Bev. They respected him because he was one of them. He dug alongside them. He wasn't someone who... The dig directors in those days, they took all the credit, but they weren't actually always there. In fact, they were absent quite a lot of the time. They always had to have someone who would be the site person in charge, which was increasingly became WEVY. He worked the same hours as them. Keiller's diaries traditionally start in the early days with hands to sight, 8 a.m, hands to sight, that's his phrase, every single day. We used to copy and paste it in our transcriptions. And Keiller would pitch up at 9:45, you know. So, but WEVY is there with the men at 8 o'clock, and off he goes. And he worked the same hours, and he also suffered the same working conditions. So if it was too much for WEVY, I think they'd say, okay, let's. But if they decided they could carry on, they would. So it was a combined effort, and he does talk about their names, as we've said, and occasionally take photographs of them. And he did realise the importance of very good working relationships on the site, because he had had experience, which he writes about, where the working relationships were not good, and it made for a very unhappy dig with not necessarily the right results. So, but he could be critical, which we'll see in a minute, about people who didn't share his particular hard work ethic. He was a really hard worker, as I think you can probably tell. So he does also tell us what's doing what. Fran mentioned that. So they could be building fences, filling things in. You get an idea of what's going on around the whole site. You're not just looking at what's going on in one area. There are people filling in. There are people returfing. There are people fixing the road and you know, things like that. Working on the excavating gang. They had a very, very skilled foreman who was always called by WEVY as O. Pierce. And for ages, for months, I thought, oh, Pierce. I mean, I looked through, I did find out who he was, of course. I knew he was called Oswald. But I thought, what did they call him? You know, what did they call him? And then it took Denis Grant King's diaries, who writes, the first page I opened, it said, Ozzie Pierce said so-and-so. So, Oswald Pierce, Ozzie Pierce, became an excavator of very great skill. Very great. They in 1940, I think it was, or maybe in the end. It's in the later diaries, very much later diaries. They're re-excavating something at Windmill Hill. WEVY goes up to start them off and leaves 4 men in the charge of Ozzie Pearce. Ozzie Pearce knows exactly what he's doing, and he knows what they should all be doing. He can keep tabs on it all, and presumably he can make the notes. WEVY just pops up every now and then to make sure it's all going well. So that's the sort of detail you want, because Ozzie Pearce is a very, very significant character in this. Unfortunately, when the war happened, the work was tailing off. Avebury itself, there wasn't any more excavation, so Ozzie Pearce was doing things like, the odd bit of returfing and stuff. I think he got fed up with it, and also there was hardly anybody left there from the original gangs, and the pay was better at Yatesbury Camp, so people went to work at Yatesbury Camp, basically, and that's what happened to Ozzie Pearce, and so he sort of drops off the radar. There'll come a point when we want to try and get in touch with families of these people to see what happened to them. So there's another line of inquiry, which is another reason why this is such a work in progress. And then there was George Bates. George Bates was everybody's hero. He was the head of the erecting gang. He wasn't actually one of Keiller's hands. He was employed by a contractor, E.H. Bradley and Son, who were a Swindon firm, who supplied Keiller with all kinds of heavy gear for lifting heavier things, the lifting gear. And George Bates was the man who knew all about it. Now, we've talked about the sort of the class system and the pecking order, which is reflected in the terms that they use for each other. Mr. So-and-so, or just young, Mr. Keiller, young, writing letters and things like that. But George Bates is Keiller says, had a meeting with George, because George is sort of somebody separate. He's like a superhero, I think. And let's see what's there. That, in fact, over there. Oh, let me get a pointer on it. Yeah, this is George Bates. He looks a good solid man, but he knew what he was doing. He was in charge of all his pulleys and things like that. These guys here. Okay, so this is Bertie Bull. Bertie Bull was one of their mainstay diggers. He had 2 brothers, Arthur and Wally, and they also were diggers for Keiller. Arthur and Wally dug up Windmill Hill and then at Avebury. I think Bertie joined them at Avebury, but Wally had actually worked with Harold St George Gray on the original early digs at Avebury too. He was quite an old chap by the time he started doing that. So this is one of the Bull family. This is Bertie Bull, Avebury people. This is Jack Goddard. Jack Goddard, who looks a bit rakish, I think, was the son of Mr. and Mrs. Goddard, who lived in Avebury, and they were WEVY's hosts. He stayed with them while he was doing the Windmill Hill digs, and sort of became part of the family. So when he came back, even though eventually he got his own accommodation courtesy of Alexander Keiller, he would always go round to the Goddards and they'd give him tea and maybe they'd cook him his lunch. He could always find somebody to cook him his lunch. And he was part of the family. When Jack has a baby, he's overjoyed. He writes it in his diary. Jack's baby's been born, So that's Jack Goddard there. And this is Arthur Ball. Do you remember Fran talking about Richard Ball, who was a thatcher? This is his son, and he is also a thatcher. And he also later in the digs started to work for the Avebury team. So that's them. Let's have a look. It also, of course, WEVY didn't just, as I've said, he didn't just work at Avebury. This is 1935, I think. Hang on a moment. Oh no, beg your pardon. This is 1931. And he's working at North Warnborough on a dig for Dorothy Liddell. Dorothy Liddell was Keiller's sister-in-law. He married Veronica Liddell, and she had dug at Windmill Hill. She was a very accomplished archaeologist, and started her own digs. This is one of them, and of course, having dug with him at Windmill Hill, she was one of the archaeologists who wanted to use WEVY, and she did. WEVY was very, very fond of Dorothy. She used to take him to church and things like that. I don't know whether she was a Catholic too, actually. I've got to look into that. But WEVY, of course, went to church. So that lot there, there's a lovely name here, look. Byron Sprules. I love that name. So this is Byron. There's Byron Sprules. And he crops up, he does about 3 or 4 years with Dorothy. He's obviously very popular. And this is Laurie Ellaway. This one is Laurie Ellaway. Now, Laurie Ellaway's father was John Ellaway, who was a great mate of George Willis. This is the sort of circles that WEVY starts to move in. George Willis and John Ellaway and WEVY used to go out flinting together all the time. They used to go on these day trips that Bev was talking about. They used to go off and look for things and have a great time. And Mr. Willis founded the Basingstoke Museum, which is now called the Willis Museum. That was actually opened in 1931, in the same year of this. And WEVY goes up to see them, he goes to help them, he advises them on what they're doing in creating their museum. And then once it's opened, he goes up to spend whole evenings with them. And they have a wonderful time together. He's really moving with the people. They weren't archaeologists. They were. Willis was actually a jeweller by trade, but they were inquiring men. Ellaway was a librarian. The library was in the bottom of the Mechanics Institute, and the museum initially was in the top of the Mechanics Institute. It's now moved, of course. So there are lots of wheels within wheels here, and also that is a Windmill Hill excavation crate there. I don't know if you can see the stencil. So obviously Dorothy's borrowing stuff from Keiller, which is fine. Yeah. This is another dig, and I love this picture because can you see all this has been returfed? The whole hill. This is thick thorn down, which was a long barrow down in Dorset. And again, and they're reading the Daily Mirror. Here we go. They've got the Daily Mirror, and you can see their boots and the nails. I just love that photograph. That's one of WEVY's photographs. But it's very interesting, this one, because he says, here we are. We've been very fortunate in having a splendid gang of men, and I was sorry when the time came for us to part. The following 7 are exceptionally good workmen and deserve the highest praise. They can be thoroughly recommended for any kind of excavation work, and I've placed them in what I consider to be their order of merit, which is what he does here. So I noticed there's a Saunders in there. I'm quite pleased about that. So off we go down here. But the sting in the tail. Braysher was fairly good, but very slow, while Bathurst was slow, talkative, and inclined to be lazy, and was the only one that I had to speak to on this account once or twice. And yet he knew this was going to be published or fully available to anybody who read the notes. So is he writing this for Dorothy, who would have seen this? Dorothy Little, she might have seen this, anybody might have seen it. This dig was actually, this is 1935, this dig was actually run by Alexander Keiller and Stuart Piggott. So, right, let me have a look. So I think I'll move on to a couple more little stories about WEVY. Anybody know where that is? Sorry? Beckhampton. Beckhampton. Well done. 4 marks. So, Beckhampton is, of course, on the way from Avebury to Devizes. Right. We've always been a great cyclist and a walker. He must have been very, very fit but they all were in those days. People did cycle a lot and they did walk a lot. He never learnt to drive, he never seemed to want to, and actually, realistically, he wouldn't have been able to afford a car anyway. People gave him lifts all the time. He was offered lifts to go anywhere. People seemed to anticipate his needs, or if they were going out for a day trip, they would take him with them. So-and-so called and said, would I like to go? So, and it's just incessant, the number of people. He had a lot of friends. He must have been very good company, because people want to take him out on day trips and things, and they want to go down and meet his family. That happens an awful lot. So he recounts lots of stories about his journeys on, as Bev has said, on the local buses. There are, I think you could work out the buses from Marlborough to Salisbury. You could work out the timetable, especially on Sundays, from there. And occasionally on a train. He's had a few interesting train journeys as well, but not very often. He doesn't do trains very often. He's just mostly going up and down from Avebury to Ebbesbourne Wake, which he goes, whenever he goes on holiday, he goes to Ebbesbourne Wake. He doesn't go anywhere else. And it suits him. He's a sociable person, and he's a very observational person. He likes to see what's going on. But anyway, for short journeys, such as Avebury to Devizes, he would use a bike every time. He had converted to Roman Catholicism in 1914. There was a preliminary thing in 1913 as well. Haven't found out quite the reason why yet, but I'm working on that one. So he was about 23, 24 when he converted to Catholicism, and apparently it was to the disapproval of his family. One presumes they were mildly Church of England, but there is no record whatsoever of any of them ever going to church. So we don't know whether that's because he chose not to write about that, or because, you have to remember that diaries are subjective, or that they actually weren't religious at all. We don't know. But anyway, they didn't really quite approve of him being a Catholic, but that was in the beginning. I suppose they got used to it. But he'd been fervently religious ever since, and so he used to get lifts to the Catholic churches wherever he was, or try and get there somehow. And obviously he had to go the day before for confession. So during this period that we're looking at now, which is 1945, we're actually in 1945, he was, every week he was cycling down to Devizes to go to the Catholic church here. That was probably the nearest one that he could get to. There was one at Yatesbury Camp, but he didn't discover that until a bit later, I think. He didn't start going there till a bit later. He liked the one in Devizes because there was a barracks in Devizes, as we all know, and at the time it was full of Polish soldiers, and the Polish soldiers were all Catholics, and they marched to the church, which he thought was wonderful, and they marched so beautifully, and then when they got there, they sang absolutely beautifully too. So that's why he used to go down to there. So this little picturesque little episode took place May 1945. The war in Europe had just finished, so it's a kind of an optimistic, the diary takes an optimistic turn. It's really, the war years are very, very interesting. Would make a talk in themselves, I think. But he's got this sense of optimism, and he's cycling off towards Avebury. There he goes. And he's going to High Mass. And I'm going to read this now. Sunday, May the 27th. Cycled into High Mass at Devizes. I left Avebury just before 9 in order to give myself plenty of time, since it is advisable to arrive half an hour before Mass commences if one wishes to get a seat in the church. There was nobody about when I started off. Everything seemed very quiet and peaceful, and no cars on the road. At Beckhampton Crossroads, interesting, no roundabout. Roundabouts didn't happen until about 1956 in this country. That's when they became sort of fairly normal, because obviously there wasn't so much traffic. I looked first up the Carl Road, then down the road leading to Marlborough, but there was nothing in sight, so I crossed over. Detail. It's so detailed. We don't really need that. Anyway, after turning right on the Devizes Road, to my astonishment, I met, of all things in the world, an elephant. Placidly walking along the road. We should have got one here. Wait a minute. Oh, we've gone back in time. An elephant. Placidly walking, and here's a really good WEVY detail, on the correct side, close to the grass verge. It was a magnificent beast. For a moment I thought I must be seeing something that was not really there. I could not see a soul in sight besides. There was the long road to Devizes ahead of me, and that was all. Thinking the elephant must have escaped from somewhere, I thought I ought to go back and report it to Sergeant Fox at the police station. So I slowed up and said, "Hello, Jumbo." So Sorry, I can't. Yeah. Where do you come from? With that, a small Indian boy appeared from behind, whom I had not seen, as he was walking on the grass verge the other side of the elephant. Even then, I wondered what on earth they were doing there and where they were going. It was such an unusual sight to meet on a quiet English road. Luckily, none of Mr. Darling's racehorses were out at the time, or there might have been some excitement among them. I went on, still very puzzled, so he didn't stop. He didn't stop and say anything, because he was going to church. I went on, still very puzzled, but after passing Shepherd's Shaw, some 2 miles further on, I met the circus party to which they evidently belonged. Whoops.
Prue, why did he turn right if he was coming from Avebury? He turned right if you're going to Caen.
No, he didn't. No, he crossed. He crossed. He did. Did I say it wrong? Thank you for picking me up on that one. It does say, wait a minute, it does say. I looked at the corner and then down the road leading to Marlborough, but there was nothing in sight, so I crossed over. I'm sure I said that. Well, never mind. It's all right, we'll forgive you. Right, anyway, so he went to church. It was full of brilliantly singing Polish soldiers. He got a puncture on the way back and repaired it just about the point where he'd met the elephant. And he didn't get back to lunch till 2 o'clock. So I love that road, but it can never be the same again. Right, I've got one last short story, which is very short. Oh, that's nice. Right, here we are in the war. Okay, so this is a little wartime story. 1943, right in the middle of the war. WEVY was working at the museum, and he spent a lot of time showing people round, an awful lot of time. Because there was a lot of fluidity in movement of troops and things like that, there were always new groups of troops who were coming to Chiselton and Yatesbury and places like that, and they all wanted showing around Avebury, and it was something for them to do when they weren't working. When the local defence volunteers came into being in May 1940, WEVY was asked to help organise the Avebury branch, which also included Windsor and Monkton. And he was, much to his obvious delight, subsequently appointed the garrison commander of the 9th Platoon B Company, which is villages to the west of Marlborough, 6th Battalion Wiltshire Home Guard. It's entirely possible that Alexander Keiller was involved in this, because Alexander Keiller had joined up as a special police officer and had gone storming up the ranks. And somebody might have said, anybody in Avebury who could do this, be in charge, and he went, I know just a man, you can see it, can't you? This was a paid post and eventually held officer status, and WEVY threw himself into it wholeheartedly. It was his patriotic duty. We've noted that he's like that, and he was justly enormously proud to be so much part of the war effort. He was a great choice. It became obvious to the local powers that be that his meticulous record keeping, an absolute passion for rules and regulations, was a godsend. And he also had the people skills, what we would now call people skills, they didn't in those days, and it made him perfect for the job. So they overloaded him with paperwork for the whole of B Company, about which he continuously complained to his diary. And eventually they bought him a duplicator. I don't know how he managed before that. No wonder he was overworked. Anyway, WEVY being WEVY, there were distinct shades of Captain Mannering about him. And I think actually anybody of our experience would find it difficult to read this whole Home Guard section of the diaries without thinking about the television series, because it is actually exactly the same. There are wonderful descriptions of things like the night musters, where they're creeping about round Avebury and making too much noise on the cobblestones in front of the museum. And I could hear them, and there's the issuing of uniforms. They were also picky. They did rifle practice in Marlborough College, which I didn't know until recently had and still has a miniature rifle range. And then there was a great bit about saluting. How do you salute, who do you salute, and when do you salute, and should we all be saluting anyway? Went on. There were only 5 of them there that night because it was snowing, and they had nothing else to do, so they talked about saluting. And then there's the nightly blockades of Beckhampton Crossroads, so you'd have 2 there, 2 here, 2 there, 2 there, and they had their spades, and they used to be, and they were wearing their civvies. It was before they got their uniforms, and it was really just like Dad's army, stopping people who were saying, "What are you doing? Now you're not stopping me." So and it's all recorded. It's brilliant. But, however, there was a serious side to this, because at 2 points in this whole thing, there is a serious threat of invasion. That does come across, from things that other people are saying and how everybody's behaving. So, and you do think that had anything else happened, we wouldn't have these fond memories of Dad's army that we do now. Thank goodness. So, anyway, WEVY was a stickler for rules, and he had problems with people who might be inclined to bend them a little. So he assumed that everybody else's moral strictures would be the same as his. And this diary entry is an example of how this mindset works in practice. So, oh, that's just a car I saw in a car park. I just parked up. I was just paying for my ticket, and I saw that. I thought, wow, yeah. Has he come back? And has he finally learnt to drive? Anyway, yes. So here's the wartime tale. Thursday, 26th of August 1943. This afternoon I took around another party of ATC officers who were attending this week's course of instruction at Avebury camp. They had transport to bring them over today, and they arrived here at 3:30. As the party were debussing in High Street, just outside the manor gates, a large motor coach pulled up behind them. I thought at first it belonged to them, until I saw a notice on the front of it, "Entertainment Party for US Troops." I'm going to give you a little trigger warning here. It's not at all woke, and it's not at all politically correct, okay? This is the way we wrote this at the time. The coach then proceeded on down High Street. As it passed us, I was amazed at the ridiculous exhibition of crazy excitement the occupants gave when they caught sight of the ATC fellows, the occupants being all painted up females. Acting like a lot of demented things, they waved, shouted and made eyes, meant to be attractive but was not. Their makeup in daylight looked perfectly hideous. There was not a decent looking girl among them. And a thought that immediately flashed through my head was, is your journey really necessary? I wonder at the authorities allowing petrol for this sort of thing. And that's it. Oh, this one here. That is WEVY's school record. Now, where is he? Wait a minute. This is him here. Look. So that is 25th of September, 1893, and his date of birth, 1890. But in actual fact, it's wrong. It's 26 was his birthday. But that's the proof that he did go to school when he was 3 or less. Poor little chap. Yeah. And that's as far as I've got. This is very much a work in progress. I've still got loads of diaries left to read. There will be lots more.